Hello, this is Chamela Martinez. Welcome to Óyeme Óyete, the podcast of the Violence Intervention Program. This is a safe space of resistance where we share personal narratives about gender-based violence. Here, you can tell your story from your point of view, raise your voice against patriarchy, and contribute to the construction of a more just world. Óyeme Óyete, and be part of the change. Today, we'll be talking about family violence and its impact on mental health and relationships. I'm happy to be joined by Michelle Balanda, V.I.P's manager of the Child and Adolescent Program. So welcome, Michelle.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Bien, Chamela. I'm so happy to be here. This is my first podcast, so I'm
Welcome,
excited.
welcome. Estamos muy felices de tenerte. We are so happy to have you on this episode.
Thank you, gracias.
So, Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what do you do in VIP?
Yes, so I'm a marriage family therapist, about to get my license because everything has been completed, so I'm crossing my fingers, ya. Solo falta one paper. So about me, I'm passionate about the work with children and about the work with women and families and survivors. So at BIP, I am the program manager for the Child Adolescent Program, like you mentioned. And honestly, my heart is in this program. We do a lot of great work with the families in our community, families that have experienced traumatic experiences. It could be medical trauma or experiences due to immigration or domestic violence, sexual abuse, many different traumas. So when they come to us, we provide them a safe space where for the first time they might start dealing with the trauma, they might start healing, and they might start talking about it. So this is a program that offers individual therapy, conjoint sessions between parent and child, and we also provide parenting support group and the teen support group. So in those services, our focus is to strengthen the relationship between the parent and the child. So that's a little bit about me and the
Thank you.
program.
Thank you, Michelle. So to get started, can you tell us what family violence means?
Yes, so family violence, also known as domestic violence, is a pattern of coercive behavior when one person tries to gain control over the other person. And this dynamic can happen in between an intimate partners or somebody that they dating or a family relationship. So it could happen between a parent and the child, or two spouses, or just somebody that you're dating. But it's specifically with the family, it's not somebody that they're dating, but more likely a family relationship. And when it comes to domestic violence, we know that domestic violence does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone, regardless of age, gender, race, economic status. And this is a big issue in the community at large. We know that 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And statistics show that 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in the US. So that's more than 12 million women and men per year. So the numbers are pretty large, and this is a significant issue that at VIP we work to support the survivors to, give them protective factors and provide trauma-informed care and cultural specific care so that we can be part of that process of healing for survivors.
Gracias, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that. The numbers are always surprising because it's like, to me, it's like, wow, that's really high, but it
Mhm.
also makes me think that there are so many cases that go unreported. So
Yeah,
that number is
actually.
probably
Mhm.
2 times higher or 3 times higher.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we do in our program is we play a Jeopardy domestic violence game with the kids, teenagers, and adolescents to give them psychoeducation about what domestic violence is. And in that game of Jeopardy, there's one question that says, how often you think that domestic violence happens in other children's houses, like, and they're like, couple times. And then when we flip and see that it's like 3 million children are witnessing domestic violence nationwide per year, they're like, wow, this happens often. So yes.
Exactly. And that's why I think like it's important to talk about it. So the more we talk about it, the more aware we are and the more we can help prevent it. Yeah.
Yes.
Can we talk about the types of violence that a family can experience?
Absolutely. So type of violence, the most frequent one that people can identify easily is physical violence. And physical violence includes anything that harms the body, anything that is a threat to the person's physical space. That can include breaking things, blocking the door for them, pulling hair, shoving, kicking, banging uh, a person's head, or using displaying weapons. That's also considered physical violence. Then we also see strangulation. And when we say strangulation, that's like a very serious level of abuse. So we know that when a person, like an abusive partner, is choking or has choked the victim, there's a higher risk of that person being murdered. So that those cases are taken very seriously. And that's how we know that violence has escalated, because violence can start with verbal and then it moves and it starts escalating. So we also can see other type of violence in the family, including sexual violence, and that includes things like forcing someone to watch pornography. And the reason why I'm naming some of the things is because sometimes these things happen and we just don't know that this is part of sexual violence. So yeah, like I said, it's forcing somebody to watch pornography or controlling the access to birth control, maybe forcing them to dress in a sexual way, specific ways, maybe involving other people in sexual activities without the consent of the other person, coercing or manipulating them to have forced sex, or coercing them to agree. And yeah, forced sex, forced rape, those are all types of sexual violence. We can see also emotional, psychological abuse in the relationships, which include isolation or the silent treatment, extreme jealousy. And that's like the typical phrase of, I love you so much that I want you all to myself, right? And in that, under that type of violence, we can also see like gaslighting, or that is also called crazy making behavior, which is when the abusive person tries to confuse the survivor so much that the survivor cannot distinguish between the reality and abuse. And they also start like minimizing their behavior, denying it, maybe threats of unaliving themselves or playing mind games. Some of the things that I have heard with mind games is like hiding things or moving things, so that the person keeps in a state of confusion. We also seen under psychological abuse that an abusive person might use the tactic of threatening to call ICS, immigration, or take the kids away. So as part of the violence, it's also the verbal abuse, the yelling, the name calling, profanity, hate speech, putting the person down. All of that has a detrimental, effect in the family. Um, but yes.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for mentioning all those different types of violence that exist. And it's also important to note that these violences can be occurring at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
One instance
Exactly.
could be happening while the other one is also happening. Like you can be getting hit while also being manipulated or being
Yeah.
gaslight,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
everyone is affected by it.
Yeah. And it happens in a cycle, right? So there's a cycle that repeats itself, and sometimes that cycle could be months of length, and sometimes it could be happen within one day. So within one day, let's say family members that are in the cycle of domestic violence, they could experience the cycle of being okay, and then everything is calm, what they call the honeymoon phase, right? And then suddenly it just starts incrementing the violence, and then there's an explosive behavior of violence. So yeah, and unfortunately that cycle becomes closer and closer as the violence progresses, and it's important to seek help and support of a professional for safety planning.
Right. And that connects with trauma. Violence brings on trauma. So
Mm-hmm.
how can we define trauma? What is trauma?
So when it comes to trauma, it's It's an experience. I'm gonna put it in a simple way. It's an experience in which a person feels unsafe and they don't know how to get back to safety. So trauma can be a one-time experience or it can be repeated, like domestic violence. Domestic violence is a repeated cycle of violence and it's actually considered a chronic trauma because of it happens so often and for so long. And not just that, but domestic violence is considered a complex trauma and intergenerational trauma. And what I like to think when it comes to trauma is that it happens too soon, too much, and too fast. So it overwhelms our nervous system and it's just too much to handle at the moment. So it overwhelms our capacity to cope. And it's just like when that happens, it doesn't just affect one person in the family. Like I have clients who are like, no, my child has never seen anything or they never heard anything. Maybe they were just experiencing psychological abuse, but sometimes psychological abuse can be even more harmful than physical. So they're like, no, my children are fine. But in marriage family therapy, we don't just think of the individual system, the individual person, the symptoms that the individual has. We think of the individual as part of the whole. So think about like fishes in the sea going together from one side to another, or like a flock of birds dancing in the air from one side to another. Somehow they're in a system, they're together. And it's the same thing with a family. So when someone in the family has experienced violence and trauma, it has the potential to affect everyone. And it might be directly or indirectly. For example, the children might not have heard anything or see anything, but they have to deal with the changes in behavior and emotions of the parents. For example, maybe the offending parent, the abusive person is no longer present in their life. They have to deal with that separation. Or the the survivor might still be present. Of course, their caregiver is present in their life, but they are going through a lot. Emotionally, they might not have the capacity to share care, love, support in the same way that they used to in the past, right?
Right. And that affects the entire family dynamic, how
Yeah.
everyone relates to one another, connects.
Yeah. And when it comes to trauma, I do have to say that there's different type of events that can be traumatic, right? We're talking about domestic violence, but there's other events that can impact the family. It could include sexual abuse, immigration, losing a loved one unexpectedly, maybe a dog bite, neglect, disaster, like natural disaster, like fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, bullying, housing and food instability, all of those could be traumatic experiences, or even like watching a loved one get arrested due to domestic violence, right? So all of these events have the potential to be traumatic, but what determines that an event was traumatic is the reaction that the person has after the trauma. So we look into how is this person coping? Are they struggling? Are they able to process what happened? Are they dealing with symptoms? Or maybe they just went into avoidance. And right now they're not allowing themselves to connect because it's too overwhelming.
Right. Can we talk a little bit more about the effects of trauma in people's mental health?
Yeah. So when it comes to trauma, after trauma, a person could be more vulnerable to mental health issues. They can experience anxiety disorders, mood disorders, eating or personality disorders. So, and specifically, directly, trauma can cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And, and specifically with domestic violence, when children witness domestic violence, in our program, we see a lot of children that develop PTSD. And some of the symptoms that could come from that, let's say it's their behavior. It affects their behavior, their emotions, their way of thinking. And just to give you some examples, some of the behaviors that we could see It's changing appetite for the person. They might be eating too much, too little. They might be sleeping too much or having difficulty sleep. Or the moment they try to fall asleep, they start getting images or sounds or thoughts into their mind that don't let them sleep. They might be reenacting drama play, especially for the little ones. This is their way of trying to gain mastery over what happens. So they keep playing the same again and again. You can see isolation behaviors, so they're withdrawing from family and friends. We can also see self-harm, like cutting, hitting themselves, or trying to run away from home. Substance abuse, danger behavior, or sexualized behavior are some of the other behaviors that we can see. But trauma in PTSD also affects their emotions. So we can see parents or children dealing with like being easily angered, crying spells, feeling hopeless, guilt, shame, a lot of blame, whether it's self-blame or blaming the other, confusion, emptiness, and it's like feeling emotionally numb and helpless. That's also part of some of the emotions that survivors go through. And it also affects the way we think. So as you can see, it's like it affects everything, not just one thing. It affects our behavior, our emotions. Now let's talk about how it affects the way we think. So before trauma, it's like everything was pretty, everything was okay. I mean, not perfect, but okay. Then trauma hits and happens, whether it's long term or a one event, and then you have new glasses. You have new glasses that have a different shape. You see the world in a different way. Now, the world might not seem safe anymore. You might have lost trust in other people. Maybe negative thoughts about yourself, your body, your image. And you might be dealing with even suicide ideations because of this trauma that happened. And not only our mind, but also our body. Trauma deeply affects our bodies. And when we're reminded of what happened and there's a trigger, we can start feeling headaches with no reason, stomach aches, heart palpitation, nausea. We think about that thing that happened and suddenly I have nausea, aches and pains, or we cannot explain why we're so tired. You might also see like grinding teeth or shallow breathing, because the first thing that happens when we're dysregulated is our breathing is affected, right? So that's one of the first things that I tell the client, okay, let's start working in learning how to relax. Let's start learning how to take deep breath, because as cliche as it sounds, our brain needs oxygen. We need to tell our body, hey, we're okay. So that's one of the first tools and most used tools that we have, right? It's that ability to be able to take a deep breath. Trauma can also make us feel hypervigilant. So it's in the constant alertness, and that is very tiring. Imagine just being constantly alert all the time, feeling that something's gonna happen. This is a difficult state of being, right? It affects our daily functioning. All of these symptoms can affect our work, our school, our social setting, and our relationships. We might not be able to trust other people, and even the way that we feel, we might feel disconnected sometimes. Some people deal with dissociation after trauma, disconnected from their thoughts. That includes memory lapses and disconnected from their own identity. So it's a pretty tough space to be in. The good thing is that there's hope, right? There's hope because when we have experienced trauma with the right support and in the community, because a lot of healing happens in community and in relationships. So surrounded by community and professional help, we can definitely have hope and healing.
Right. It's very true what you say about community happens in healing, because I can talk from my own experience someone has how someone that has been through trauma, how being alone and trying to navigate that trauma by yourself and trying to
Yeah.
investigate, okay, what can I do to help myself, or what does this mean? What happened? Because, things happen when you're younger that
Mhm.
as you grow, then you start to realize, oh, I went through this and I went through that. And then you start analyzing and thinking and seeing all the ways that you were affected and how your mental health it is still affected by those events that happened
Yeah.
when you were younger. Whereas,
Mhm.
sometimes you might think like, oh, that some people say like, oh, that happened like a long time ago. Just like
Mm-hmm.
get over it. And it's like it doesn't work like that. That's not how
Mm-hmm.
the body works. Like the
I
body
wish.
keeps score. And the body keeps score of
Yes. Oh my
everything.
God, I love that book.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. The body keeps score. And as a survivor myself of trauma too, like honestly, being able to heal in community and being able to be in spaces where I feel safe, which also takes time, to be able to learn how to trust people. We're social beings. We need to connect. If we're not connected with other people, there's a part of us that is dying inside. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but honestly, we get sad and we get depressed when we're lonely. And part of domestic violence is that isolation. So we have to break that isolation by starting the wheel, like when you start doing something little and then you have the energy to keep on going, it's the same thing. It's like, okay, maybe I'm gonna go to the park and put myself seeing people from a distance. And then maybe there's a Zumba class. I might just go for 5 minutes and then, just start joining community spaces that can be good and healing for us.
I love that. So, can we talk about how trauma affects the family?
Yes. So trauma affects the family in many ways. First, it creates emotional dysregulation in the family. So it affects the interaction between one family member and the others. So at the beginning, we see families that might not want to speak about what happened. They're going into avoidance. Avoidance is a big part of trauma. They don't want to talk about it, think about it, have go do any activity that reminds them of what happened. And that is because it's uncomfortable. They might have thoughts, feelings, and other symptoms that might come up, and they don't know how to deal with it because we don't have the skills yet, right? So it's overwhelming. But at some point, the trauma symptoms start sneaking in, right? So we might see behaviors and attitude, emotions changing in the family members, and that's going to lead to family conflict increase. So we're going to see more siblings start fighting with each other. Maybe children are not longer want to follow the parents' directions, listen to the parents. Parents and children are going to start fighting more often. So the communication of the family is affected. And their interactions, what happens with the interactions is that they start acting as if they are triggers to one another. So for example, let's say that a child witnessed domestic violence and they're experiencing PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And the child, let's say the child was 7 years old, and this is me making something up. The child is 7 years old, they are witnessing domestic violence, their parent is in danger, and they pick up the phone, call the police. And after that incident, they're dealing with anger, guilt, sadness, all these feelings. But anger is the thing that they can feel the most because they're emotionally numb at this point. But they can feel that anger coming up. So they throw things, they're like having these anger symptoms. So one day mom comes up and she says, go clean your room or I'm going to send you back to your dad, right? Because I hear that often. And for this kiddo who's experiencing all these symptoms, that becomes a trigger. How are you gonna send me? They're not verbalizing it, but how are you gonna send me back to the person that hurt us, right? So let's say that at that point, that child is increasing their symptoms, they're becoming reactive, right? And because they were triggering my mom. Now, mom, on the other hand, sees how her child reacts back with anger. They're throwing things, hitting, saying offensive things. Mom has already dealt with like an anger outburst and violence from the abusive partner. So now mom is also being triggered, leading her to symptoms of sadness, isolation, also anger. So as you can see, it becomes a pattern between the family members triggering one another. And let me give you another example because I love this type of example so we can see how it happens in the family.
Yes, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, so let's say we have a parent who wants their child to behave well. and they tell the child, if you don't behave well in school, I'm gonna send you to our home country or to foster care. They're gonna come and get you. I hear that too. So this could trigger the child's feeling of helplessness, betray, abandonment, hurt, and the child responds with something like, I want to go live with my dad. So the mom already triggered the child. Now the child said something, I want to go live with my dad. Let's say that the dad was the abusive person in this case, right? Now the mother also becomes angry. Now she becomes also hurtful to the child back again. So they're hurting each other in ways that they don't know that has been caused by trauma. So at the end, we have family members that love each other, that children that need the love of their parents, and parents who adore their children, but because of trauma and not being aware of the patterns that is happening, they are creating chronic patterns of destructive behavior in the family. And at this point, they don't know how to deal with it. So that's where they come and seek help, right? And when we see these behaviors of triggering one another, there's like an emotional arousal in the family. So this affects the capacity of showing support, patience, consideration for other family members. And the bad part of this, the unfortunate part, is that the family members begin to distrust each other. So they don't see each other as safe people anymore. So they don't feel like if I tell you something, you're going to be confident. I'm not going to be confident that you're going to respond to me and you're going to listen to me in a helpful way. So that creates distance and that deteriorates the relationship between the parent and the child.
There's so many effects that I feel like when you're in the moment of so many traumatic events or something is happening in the home that we don't think about like what are the consequences of if you're in an adult relationship. Like you don't start to think about like, oh, if I am being violent in my home, how is that affecting my children? Like I don't feel like it's talked
Mm-hmm.
about often, how in the moment we don't really think about all the effects that can come up. We think about that
Yeah.
later on when we start seeing the signs, or even if we don't
Mm-hmm.
start seeing the signs. So I feel like
Mm-hmm.
there might be some cases where you don't see the signs in the child or in the younger um
Yeah.
parts of the family. Because I can talk from my
Yeah.
personal experience how
Mm-hmm.
growing up, of course, there was domestic violence that happened, but it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
until I started working here at VIP that I was like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
oh, that identifies as
Yeah.
domestic violence that I
Yeah.
witnessed as a
Mm-hmm.
child. But as a child, I was definitely not thinking like, oh, I'm like my dad is in trouble, I need to call the police. Like I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
thinking that. I was just like scared. I can tell you like
Yeah.
the feelings that I was feeling and what happened, but I can't tell
Mm-hmm.
you like that I took action or that I thought about it for years. Like that didn't
Mm-hmm.
happen. It was more like kind of just like in the back of the mind till I got more knowledge on it and was like,
Yeah.
oh, identify what happened.
Yeah. And that's part of healing, right? Because when things are happening, we're just going to react. Our body's going to react. We're probably going to have symptoms or maybe not. We can be resilient and be okay. But part of the healing from trauma and from things that happen, stressful moments, is being able to name those things, being able to understand what happened, make sense, and make meaning out of what happened. So I know that domestic violence happen in my life, but it does not define me. It does not define the relationships that I'm going to have in the future. I understand how to have healthy relationships now. I do the emotional work to be able to do that. So that is part of healing, being able to name it. And yeah, sometimes there's children that have not the anger outbursts, but that are very quiet and are very more fearful. And that is because our brain reacts in different ways to trauma. And we can have either a fly, fight, or freeze response. And sometimes we go into freeze mode, and that looks as in shutting down or not finding the words to speak. But those children also need support, especially sometimes children might go into an adultification mode, and just like, let's say they will focus on their education and just study, study, study because that's their safe space, right? And it becomes to the point where they also need to have balance in other parts of their life. And if they're not avoiding it through studying, then they have to deal with the emotions that come up. So we have to deal with the quiet ones and the ones that are not so quiet, because domestic violence affects the whole family. It coming to my head right now is that it affects the routines, the rituals of the family. Sometimes families have to move into shelter, have to deal with court, lost their jobs, and that disrupts the family regular cycle.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you so much, Michelle,
Yeah.
for adding that on and having this conversation that I think it's just very important to have. How does domestic violence repeat in different family generations?
So domestic violence, it's a learned behavior. So children observe violence and then they think it's normal or it's acceptable. The children begin to internalize, okay, this is a normal way of behaving. So they are at risk of repeating the cycles. There's something called the triangle of trauma that shows you the roles that a person can identify with. Either they can identify with a perpetrator, a victim, or a rescuer. And not, you don't win in none of these roles, right? It's a difficult and tough place to be in, but it's good to know that when a person has experienced trauma, they can repeat the cycle by identifying themselves with one of the roles. So we have to work to prevent that. And when it comes to domestic violence, as I mentioned before, it's considered intergenerational trauma. And what that means is that after trauma happens, the effect of trauma, it's if it's unprocessed and unresolved, it's gonna go into the next generation. And parents will pass down their unresolved emotions, unresolved behaviors, psychological responses will be passed down to the children. So in V.I.P, we can see that a lot of families have experienced or witnessed DV when they were children, and somehow the cycle's repeating again because of the intergenerational trauma. So when it comes to intergenerational trauma, there's two things that affects family. The first one is our DNA, and the second one is relational. And it's not that trauma happened and now our DNA changes, not necessarily. But what happens is that the trauma has an effect, an epigenetic effect, adjustment in the gene, in the genetics. So let's say that the part of our genes that helps us regulate stress is not working right because of this trauma. So it might not turn on or it might not turn off at the right time. It's just not as effective. So the generation that experienced trauma, right? They are having to deal with the effect, but they're not really processing trauma. Let's say this is the first generation, right? The second generation deals with the DNA adjustment. So now they have difficulty handling stress, their capacity to regulate is affected, and that generation also doesn't deal with the trauma. Let's say the next generation. The next generation is children who have not directly been affected by the trauma, but are still dealing and are still impacted by trauma through learned behaviors and the relationship with the affected parent, because their parenting style has been affected by trauma. So let me give you an example. A child living with a parent who's a survivor struggles. The parent struggles with anxiety, with emotional withdrawal, with being hypervigilant and alert all the time. Let's say that this parent is really struggling with their symptoms and they cannot express affection, they cannot be open about their emotions. So the child is gonna be affected because the child can grow up feeling disconnected from the parent. Maybe they're not sure if my parent loved me or not. I might have to suppress my emotions and it's not a safe space for me to talk about it, about things. Maybe I have to walk on eggshells because I don't know when my parents are gonna blow up because maybe they're experiencing irritability from their trauma response. So the children can grow up feeling lonely and not have the same ability to cope with stress and anxiety than a person who doesn't have intergenerational trauma deals with, right? So yeah, this is a factor that most clients deal with, and it takes one person to be able to change You know, it takes like one, not one person, but it takes small changes to be able to change. And I like to think of the butterfly effect. Have you heard of it?
Yes, yes, I have.
Yeah, so the same way it's like the butterfly effect. One butterfly, the flapping of the wings can cause a hurricane somewhere else. So it's the same thing that we're doing with intergenerational trauma, creating change and stopping that change of that on deal with, like, we haven't dealt with that trauma to stop passing it to our next generation. And it's hard work. It's hard work.
Right. It's really hard work. So that brings up on like how do we start healing? And it makes me think of how people that have been through trauma are also at a disadvantage with other people that are their same age that haven't been through trauma, and
Yeah,
how that connects with healing, and how our own judgment of ourselves that we've been through hard things and we tend to
yeah,
not acknowledge that part and think that we must be at the same level as someone else who hasn't been through trauma, who hasn't been triggered in any way and has
yeah,
lived a well, you know, a
yeah.
really good life without any trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, that's part of the process of healing. When you start noticing that some people don't struggle as much as you do because you have been through all this trauma, and maybe you're experiencing complex trauma from different sources, you know, and you're struggling with your thoughts or with your feelings, with body sensations, sometimes maybe a depression cycle or anxiety, or all three at the same time, you know. So part of that is grief, the grief of not not having that, you know, and learning how to be in a space of acceptance and kindness and empathy with yourself, and knowing that healing is not linear, that there's ups and downs, and that we have to continue seeking support and continue talking to ourselves in a kind way, and eventually we start healing slowly but surely we can see like changes that give us hope. So yeah.
Right.
And you asked about how can we start healing, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I when it comes to families, I really think that the knowledge of trauma impacting the family is very important, because if we recognize that the behaviors, attitudes, emotions that we're seeing in the family and our family members are not because they're mean, not because they're bad people or because they're being rebellious, but because those are trauma reactions. And then we can be a little more understanding and increase empathy between family members, right? Because there's a lot of blame. There's like, it's I did this or you did this, and guilt and shame, and empathy and kindness really start lowering those emotions. At the same time, I would say that before I mentioned that trauma happens too much, too fast, too soon, right? And the healing part is the opposite. So when it comes to trauma, we have to be at a slower pace, and we have to be patient, allowing our body, our nervous system, our mind to process and to heal. So this way we can know and be prepared to know that this is a path, it's a journey, that it might take time, and we have to be kind to ourselves. When it comes to healing, I like to think that parents have a special place in the healing of a family, right? And they have a lot of power to support themselves and their children, even though it doesn't feel like it at the moment because of everything that they probably experience. But parents can engage in services, in parenting sessions. Um, Sometimes, especially in our community, we might see parents that just want a problem fix. They have too much to deal with, understandably. They have to deal with the housing or food and immigration and other children's, and it's really difficult. But if we have a parent that it's open to learning, they in open to working on this with their children, is very helpful because they can be a support and a role model for the children. So in parenting sessions, we engage with parents to move away from criticism and blaming into curiosity and supporting the children and getting to learn and to talk to them differently and to be more positive in the way that they speak to the children. And also families can like engage in laughter and fun activities, playing, relaxation. You know, after trauma, we have to make sure that we keep the house routines and rituals so that we can have some sense of control in the house. Um, and yeah, in order to seek further support and healing, we have to also look at the option of seeking professional help. Having a kind therapist that can guide you through the process can be very helpful.
And I like what you just mentioned right now about guiding, because that's how I see therapists, as a guide, not just as someone that you go to vent, or someone that you go to because you are crazy, because that's what people want to think about when
Mhm.
you're seeking help. And it's no, it's more of a guide. It's someone that it's gonna help you rebuild trust and relationships, and also help you travel through those things that you went through. Put words to it, meaning to it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Can we talk a little
yeah.
more
I
about how someone who is licensed, a mental health professional, can help the family in their healing process of experiencing violence and trauma?
So a psychotherapist that specializes in trauma can help us, can help the family understand how trauma has impacted them and their loved ones, can help them understand how trauma affects our brain, our emotions. They can help them explore, you know, what triggers them, what patterns or conflicts are happening in the family, and how to shift that, how to make those changes, how to deal with the symptoms that they're feeling. So in a therapeutic space, this is a safe and confidential space where you can practice your coping skills, where you can practice being vulnerable, when you can practice validating feelings, normalizing, where you can practice self-care, and a therapist can be a role model too. They can show you how to set boundaries and how to have a trusting relationship with somebody, how to listen and be active listening, right? So those are skills that we might not have had somebody do with us before, teach us before. And just through the relationship. And it's not like they're teaching us intentionally. This just happens as part of the relationship. And that therapeutic relationship is very important. So when looking for a therapist, it's important to be able to feel connected to that person. If you feel that this is a good person for you, that you feel a connection, that you feel supported and cared for, then go ahead, have the therapy sessions with that person. But if you don't, then go ahead. Don't be afraid of asking for another referral. Don't be afraid of changing. And I know that it could be not so easy sometimes to find a mental health referral, right? But it's good to give you the space to have someone that you feel connected to and feel heard, right? So a lot of the things that a psychotherapist can do is also like coaching parents in being more empathetic and understanding to their children. In therapy, they can show you how to relax, how to feel grounded. And the thing with trauma is that what the healing process is easy, but it's hard to do. These are easy, simple things, but those easy, simple things are hard to do, like coping skills. Coping skills include like breathing, grounding exercise, being able to manage your emotions, being able to sit with uncomfortable emotions, being able to express them in a healthy way, being able to communicate. But those little coping skills, they take hard work. And some people think they just try it once and they're like, oh no, this doesn't work. But it takes practice. It's like a muscle. You're building a muscle. So first, coping skills need to be practiced when you're calm at home or when you're calm. And then once you get better at it, then you can practice it when you have a crisis. So that you have a strong muscle to deal with those crises. And then it will be more effective on your body, right? So definitely seeking a licensed mental health professional. It's a good idea, and I recommend it, especially if you want this to stop with you, if you want this to uh, not be passed down to other generations. It's best to seek support and not be alone. Also, there's support groups that are also great in providing support, because one of the ideas that come to trauma is, oh no, this is just happening to me. But no, there's other people that are going through similar experiences, and connecting with them can be very healing too.
Thank you, Michelle, for what you have just shared and for holding this conversation with us today. For anyone listening, keep in mind that there are resources out there available for you, and it's okay to seek help, whether you have been going through something now or something happened to you a couple years ago when you were younger. You can seek help at any point. I don't know if Michelle wants to add anything else before we close out the conversation for today.
I want to say thank you, Chamela. This has been so much fun. Invite me to podcast. I'm good with this. This is great. I just want to say to everyone that there's hope, there's a lot of hope. And sometimes things might feel difficult at the moment, but just know that there's hope, and that for those who have experienced trauma in their childhood or are experiencing trauma right now, that with healing comes the ability to have healthy relationships and more fun in life and success and meet your goals. So that is definitely a possibility. And yeah, wishing everyone a good day.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to follow us on all of our social media platforms, to subscribe to the podcast for more discussions on important topics like this one that we had today on addressing family violence and trauma, which is crucial for us to heal and build together and to have healthier families overall. So, gracias. This is Chamela Martinez, Digital Outreach Specialist. Thank you for listening today. If you want to share a story, write to us at Óyeme Óyete at V.I.P. The Violence Intervention Program is an organization that operates in New York City with bilingual services for victims of domestic and sexual violence. If you or someone you know is going through an abusive situation, call our helpline at 1-800-558-6664 or visit our website at www.vipmujeres.org. Remember, we believe you and we are here to support you. Until next time.